Hello, subscribers. So I would have liked to respond to a new atheist this time, but my new technique for voice synthesizing has a problem. The program is apparently still in beta, and has some kinks to work out. Most notably, I can't delete or replace any of my cloned voices. This means the more voices I clone, the more cluttered it will get. If the program was perfect, this wouldn't be a problem. But since some voices either don't work very well or just don't work at all, I would need to re-record certain voices, including my own. This combined with a new video by Mindshift that piqued my interest means that this video will be a response to
Transformation Jutsu!
Mindshift's latest video called God's Hypocrisy, the case against objective morality, and we can see all the charges he's planning on making in the thumbnail. Now, Mindshift also has videos called Secular Bible Studies, so hopefully he should be able to avoid straw manning like he has with his past videos. And I suspect more honest mistakes and/or misunderstandings rather than blatant misrepresentations. But there is an obvious question brought up by the title. Assuming God is a hypocrite as he is alleging, how is that a case against objective morality? Well, let's start the video and find out.
So I'm not going to be addressing the objective versus subjective claims of morality in this video. I simply want to point out that God's objective morality does not work.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean morality as created by God? Or do you mean the morality God goes by? What do you mean by God's objective morality?
Typical fashion on this channel, we will be doing so with a list. I'm going to list 20 things that should be objectively wrong according to God, according to the Bible, according to the law that he put on our hearts. And I'm not going to use Christians as the example or the misdeeds of believers as the example. I'm going to use God as the example. Surely, if we have 20 things that are objectively wrong according to this Bible, according to this God, then the number one person who should never break them without excuse would be God himself.
Well, that's in keeping with the title. But the last time you gave me a list, I was not impressed. Hopefully you don't conflate them this time. And judging by the bookmarks in his video, he did do better this time.
Now, I can already hear all the Christian excuses. A lot of what I'm going to be covering is Old Testament. They're going to say it doesn't matter. They're going to say we have a new law, a new covenant because of Jesus' sacrifice, Paulinity versus Christianity.
Who the heck says Paulinity? That actually sounds like blasphemy.
So I'd like to point you to all of the verses about God's immutability, meaning God does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If these things were important to God at one point and they were wrong at one point, they should be wrong now. If they are not still wrong, are they objective?
This sounds like something we should keep in mind. He is making this list as an argument against objective morality, but how much of it will actually be about objective morality, and how much will be laws that were specific to Israel?
Now, what are we basing this off of? We're not going to base it off just the 10 Commandments because, first of all, there's multiple versions of the 10 Commandments.
Since when? What are you even talking about? Exodus 20 is the go-to passage for the 10 Commandments, and on the screen, he also mentioned Deuteronomy 5, which is basically a flashback to that time Israel got the commandments. So it's not a different version. In fact, it's practically verbatim the same. And the last one he has on screen is Leviticus 19. And that is way more than 10 commands, which begs the question, why are you calling Leviticus 19 a different version of the 10 Commandments? 10 Commandments are sprinkled in there, but that's not a reason to call these, I think 30-some commands, a different version of the 10 Commandments.
So number one is going to be lying, right? We can all agree it is wrong to lie. Some of you are already screaming, well, it depends, right? What if the Nazis come to your door? Isn't it a greater good to protect people than it is to lie? I don't know, not according to God. Bearing false testimony against your neighbor is actually one of the commandments, which is a little bit different than lying. But we see through many parts of the Bible, let your yes be yes and your no be no. We should expect that lying is always wrong if something is objectively wrong. And I could give you quite a few examples. My favorite to point to is usually Rahab lying for the soldiers and not getting in trouble. In fact, being blessed and preserved by God for it. But let's go with 1 Kings 22:23. And actually, it's verse 21, and I covered this in my secular Bible study series on 1 Kings when we got to problematic passages. But in 21, it says, "Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you." Go ahead, look up the context for this verse. This is like God having a council with his spirits, coming up with a game plan of how he's going to manipulate the will of people on earth to create the action and desired outcome that he wants. And he does so by taking the suggestion of a spirit who says, I'm going to lie. I'm going to create them to lie. The Lord says, yes, do it. Let it be so. This verse is absolutely inexcusable. Not only does it completely interrupt our free will, but we have a God who is endorsing, commanding, and saying, this is the plan I want, and I will make sure that it works. And the plan is deceit and lying.
So there are a few mistakes here. First, God doesn't make a game plan. He already knew what was going to happen before he even created the world. Second, let's be clear that God was not lying. He only allowed a spirit to lie. However, there is more to say than just that. One is that this is the prophet talking, giving the word from the Lord that he was given. It isn't necessarily 100% literal. Also, does it still count as a lie if you tell the person what you allowed to be said to them was not true, before any harm could come from the lie? I would say this passage does not do what you think it does in terms of impugning God's character. He sent his prophet to tell Ahab that his prophets were lying to him, and even gives him a reason for their lying. You falsely claim this passage has God violating our free will, but it does not. At worst, it has God violating the false prophet's free will. But this very passage presupposes that Ahab has free will. Otherwise, he would not have needed to be tricked by the false prophets. Of course, that assumes the very literal interpretation Mindshift is going for. It is entirely possible that the lying spirit is just a metaphor used to give Ahab the best reason to distrust his false prophets. What's really funny is early in this section, Mindshift mentioned the whole "would you lie to save someone" thing and said not according to God. But then he mentions Rahab saving the spies, which I know he would want to say is hypocritical, but to me it just looks like Mindshift isn't seeing the forest for the trees. He quotes, "Let your yes be yes, and your no be no," but the context of the verses that have that is about taking oaths, not any sort of lying. Just don't make false promises. So I don't think Mindshift did a great job detailing how lying was supposed to be objectively wrong in all circumstances, let alone how God is at all hypocritical about it. I have a suspicion that Mindshift does not know what objective means.
Right into number 2, and let's go with killing babies, infanticide. Surely killing babies is always wrong, right? Don't the preachers and pastors and apologists love to point to the inherent dignity of people, of how God formed you in the womb and knew how many hairs you had on your head? That's taken out of context. For the abortion arguments from the Christian perspective, we hear all kinds of these things about fetuses, yet alone actual babies and small children. So I'm sure God never ever kills babies. But let's go ahead and turn to Isaiah 13, and we'll jump up just to the immediate verse. The context starts around verse 11, if you would like to go back. But in 16, he says, their infants will be dashed in pieces before their eyes. This is a punishment from the Lord, by the way, killing these people's babies.
Funny how he starts out by saying the context begins in verse 11, but then he stops at verse 16 when the context continues on. 17 and 18 read, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. Also their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye will not spare children." So who will be dashing those babies? Oh yes, it's the Medes, not God.
I talk about the example all the time of the punishment for David for sleeping with Bathsheba and having her husband murdered was to torture and then kill David's infant son for 7 days. Go read it.
I suppose Mindshift wanted God to just kill the baby outright and not leave it in the air for 7 days. But we don't actually know what kind of pain, if any, the baby was in. But let's assume a lot of pain. The overall quantity of pain would still be leagues less than what the child would receive growing up. Instead, he gets to go be with God, maybe get a second chance at life during the millennial reign. God did that child a favor only God can give, by the way. He is God, he gave life, he can take it away. And this isn't even bringing up all the multiple different reasons God could have had for punishing David in that way.
We could talk about the flood. How many babies and fetuses died in the flood?
Did you want God to make babies float?
We can talk about all the firstborn sons of Egypt that God murdered after hardening Pharaoh's heart so that he could perform this plague. Granted, many of the firstborns would have been older, but many would have been babies. Many would have been toddlers that had absolutely nothing to do with the captivity of the Jews. Not that that existed.
Laugh out loud. Ha 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 ha. Wow, denying basic history. Well, putting aside the out-of-nowhere claim that Exodus didn't happen, the killing of the firstborn was not without precedent. Egypt, only a generation or two ago, had killed all the male babies of Israel. This is called poetic justice.
How about in every single genocidal command, and we'll talk about genocide in a future point, where God says, yes, actually also be sure to kill the children. Or that time when Moses got mad because all of those boys, the little boys, had not been murdered. They had been spared. And he said, nope, let's fix this right now. And one by one, by one, by one, they killed every last little boy. You know why they didn't kill the little girls? We'll get to that when we talk about sexual slavery.
Not if you're smart, you won't. Israel did not allow for sex slaves in their law, and Mindshift slipped up and got rhetorical here. The Bible does not say they killed them one by one. That is just hyperbolic rhetoric. This section makes me want to read Paul Copan's book again. Maybe Mindshift could do with a read of it himself. I wonder if Mindshift would prefer those male children become permanent slaves, because that would be the only other option that could be considered merciful. Or maybe he wanted them to be homeless and wandering the wilderness.
But Brandon, none of this stuff happens anymore. I mean, we didn't see Jesus doing any of this stuff. We also didn't see him condemning it. We didn't see him saying, you know what, I was bound by the people and the time, as if it was so different, as if morality had matured so much by Jesus's time that it hadn't in the centuries preceding it. He'd never said we were wrong back then or we had to do what we had to do, but I'm here now. Going forward, let's not do this stuff anymore. Nope, he's here to uphold and fulfill the law.
Okay, I wasn't going to say anything there, but he just implied that killing infants was a part of the law. What are you talking about? Yes, Jesus did not condemn his own commands, but the commands you're going over in this section are not part of the law.
I'll give you one more quick one from 1 Samuel. This is 15, verse 2. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote destruction, all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. And before you give me the hyperbole example that is so common in Christian apologists that really is founded in Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, I'd encourage you to see the follow-up. Go ahead and read context for yourself. Anytime that someone didn't follow this to the letter of the law, they were punished by God for not being severe enough, for not doing what he asked of them exactly. In fact, it's Saul who loses his throne to David because he was unwilling to kill the king and a few sheep. Meaning he had followed all of these other commandments. He really did kill the women. He really did kill the children. He really did kill all the livestock. But he left a few alive and he left the king alive. And God said, that's not what I asked of you. So the hyperbole thing is ridiculous.
Hey, look at that. He mentioned the very book that I just did, but apparently he never read it. Paul Copan did not cite hyperbole as the answer to Saul failing to kill the Amalekites. He briefly mentions it, but it's not primary. His main point is twofold. One, that the city Saul was sent to destroy was a military outpost, or at least just a city, not a whole nation. And two, that the Amalekites were clearly still around after this, which brings me to another thing Mindshift got wrong. He said that because Saul didn't kill the king and some sheep, that somehow that means he did kill everyone else, women and children included. This does not follow. Saul already lied once. Why should we believe that there weren't more people he didn't kill?
Jealousy. Jealousy is something that should be objectively wrong, correct?
Wrong. Perhaps you are confusing jealousy with envy. They are not the same.
Well, no, I'm married and I'm jealous for my wife. Okay, fine. You can play that kind of a game if you want. But jealousy falls right in with coveting, with lusting, etc.
No, it doesn't. That is more comparable to envy. In fact, the word jealousy is used just a few verses earlier, which I assume is the verse you're going to try and use to claim some sort of hypocrisy.
And yet, what do we see from God himself? Even in the first 4 commandments, he's essentially saying, have no other gods before me, speaking about his jealousy and his desire to be the only one.
Called it.
In the 5th book of the Bible, chapter 4, verse 24, we get God saying this: "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." In Joshua 24, we get the tie-in of God being both holy and jealous. In 1 Corinthians 10:22, Paul talks about the jealousy of the Lord. It's not even just Old Testament God. We have a jealous God. And Christians have tried to make it sound pretty. He's jealous for us. He wants our love. That's domineering and it's abusive. If you had any other relationship where someone commanded that you love them or else suffer pain and death and torture, that kind of jealousy is not some sweet little, oh, I love my wife so much, it hurts me when she talks to other men, which is still problematic. God's jealousy is tied directly with his wrath. God's jealousy is a self-serving jealousy of wanting to be the only God, the best God, to be glorified, to be worshipped.
Well, that's some strong rhetoric, but that's all it is. If I get married, then I will have an obligation to love my wife and be faithful. She has the right to be jealous over me, and I her. If I am unfaithful, then I deserve to burn. Unfaithfulness is a serious offense. And that is the context of every passage mentioned. Also, just to remind you, there is no hypocrisy here, because there is no verse that condemns jealousy. This whole argument relies on conflating covetousness with jealousy, but they are not the same.
Okay, so let's move on to number 4. I'm going to do vindictive. Now, this is going to be close to 5, which is unforgiving, but they're different. So for vindictive, we should be able to say that vindictive and vengeful are objectively wrong. God says not to hold grudges, not to be bitter, to turn the other cheek, which might be leading a little bit into forgiveness.
And don't forget Deuteronomy 32:35, vengeance belongs to me and also recompense. It's pretty clear at this point Mindshift is trying to hold God to human standards. Not every command for humans to do will apply to God, and this is a primary example. Humans should not seek vengeance because vengeance is the Lord's. Although even then, vengeance is not strictly forbidden.
When I think of God being vindictive, I think of all of the times that he smote people for innocuous acts, like when the Ark of the Covenant was about to fall and someone put their hand up to steady it and God struck them dead, or when Aaron's sons didn't quite do the fire ritual correctly and so they were both struck dead. We have a petty, vindictive, and vengeful God. This is a God that takes revenge.
Now you're conflating vengeful with petty. They are not the same. Actually, I am not even sure vindictive should be conflated here, but this is looking like a long video, so I don't want to waste time looking up the semantics. But God is not petty. He is holy. The respect owed to him is greater than any human could conceivably achieve. He gave specific commands concerning the Ark of the Covenant which were not followed, and Aaron's sons lit the incense while drunk.
Who claims it for himself. In fact, the only reason we might believe that vengeance is not okay is because God says, don't do it, it's mine, I get to.
Get to? Are you envious of God's right to vengeance? That might explain why you seem so angry at him. But we see here again he cites one of the verses which directly refutes himself.
So let's move into example number 5, which is going to be unforgiving. Now, surely this one is obvious. God tells us to forgive. Really, what it's saying is always forgive. Forgive as I have forgiven you, which doesn't make much sense. I'd encourage you to watch my video on rationalizing redemption because God did not forgive at all. Adam and Eve messed up one time before they knew what right or wrong was, and he cursed everybody for all time. That is the opposite of forgiving.
Just because they were punished does not mean they were not forgiven. Forgiving someone is separate from that person's punishment. For example, you can forgive the person who killed your family, but they still go to jail. Or let's say someone rapes your daughter, and after they do their time, you forgive them. Are you still going to let them near your daughter? Of course not, because forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiving just means you won't hold a grudge unnecessarily. An example of God being unforgiving to Adam and Eve would be if he continually invented new punishments for them, which he did not.
God used a blood sacrifice through Jesus so he could forgive us, but then we still have to believe in him? That doesn't make any sense.
How does that not make sense? If I say come over here and give me a hug, and you just pretend I'm not there and walk on by, then you will never get the hug that I promised. Now that analogy was a bit weak because it sounds like we each have a hug to give, but the point should still be clear.
We 100% have a God who is not forgiving. Let me give you some examples from the Bible. How about Joshua 24:19? And Joshua said unto the people, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. Here's the rest of that verse, though. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins.
Context is king. This was a warning to the people of Israel, which they accepted, by the way. What did you want Joshua to say? God will forgive all your transgressions and sins, just try not to make a habit out of them, pretty please. Try to use some critical thinking.
In 2 Kings 24:3-4, you can read the context for yourself, but it ends with saying, and the Lord was not willing to forgive. So he can just turn this off, supposedly. Again, vindictive, vengeful, unforgiving, they're kind of running together, but in the 5th book of the Bible, 29:20, the Lord will never be willing to forgive them. His wrath and zeal will burn against them.
This is also basically covered by my last point. But to continue, if forgiveness is just passed out like candy without any regard to who gets it or why, then it loses all meaning. Also, I'm guessing it would be a bit hypocritical of you to think it should be given to everybody when I'm sure you think there are some people who should not be forgiven, at least not in this life. You seem to hold God to human standards when it suits you, but when human standards are sufficient, all of a sudden, now God needs to be better.
Here's a fun thought. How about how God has not forgiven all of the angels and Satan himself? There's no redemptive path for them. Sure, we can think about how God likes to treat humans, but if it's his nature to be forgiving like he commands us to be, and since we're made in his image, isn't it interesting that he has absolutely no desire to do so?
We don't have the full story on angels. It's entirely possible they have their own path to redemption that has not been shared with us.
Going back to vindictive, how about Proverbs 1:24-30, where he says, I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock you when your fear cometh. This is because I have called and you refused. I have stretched out my hand and no man regarded.
Now that was bad. For someone who says he's reading in context, he really took that one out of context. That passage is not God talking, it's wisdom. Just go back to verse 20 to get the full context.
But I guess where the problem with God's objective morality is, who decides when it's okay to kill?
God does, obviously. Seriously, you could just move on to the next section from here.
God needed his chosen people to inhabit his chosen land, Canaan. All the death and destruction and murder, or just killing along the way, was completely permissible. Now, I understand in ancient times, war had to happen. War still happens. The nature of man is to conquer and invade, and murder is going to happen. It doesn't make it right, by the way, but God should be bigger than this, no? He has them wander around in the desert for 40 years. Why not use a miracle for good? Bless the land, have it grow into something better than Canaan, and give this uninhabited land as the chosen land for the chosen people.
But of course, Mindshift doesn't want to move on. He has to go on a tangent about how God could have done it differently, completely ignoring the fact that God had already made a covenant with Abraham and Israel. What Mindshift recommends would actually make God a liar. It's called the Promised Land because God promised it to Israel.
We can look at any punishment that has murder as its end result. There could have been less harsh punishments, right? What are we supposed to do with the girls who are not virgins on their wedding night? Return them to their father's doorstep and stone them. What are we to do with children when they disobey or dishonor the parents? We are to stone them to death. What are we supposed to do with the people who believe in other gods who might try to convince us of that? We are to kill them.
Literally, none of those examples are murder. They were all justified killings. Not only were they commanded by God, which that alone gives justification, but God also gave the reasons for the executions. They were not arbitrary.
God is a murderer.
You have yet to prove that. And by the way, you never could, because your concept of justice comes from God. So almost by definition, everything he does was just and will be. Just don't conflate God's position with man's position like you've been doing all video. You are not God. You cannot play God.
Genocide. Surely the wiping out of another people group completely should be wrong.
Does anyone else feel this is getting repetitive? God could wipe out the entire world if he wanted. He, and only he, has that right. You may not like it when God sends you to hell, but you have no right to claim he's in the wrong. You have the privilege to disagree with him, but all your privileges and rights come from him.
We are told God is a loving God, a forgiving God, a God who desires for every single person to know him and to be saved, to have a relationship with each individual. How does that happen when entire people groups are wiped off the face of the planet? How do you believe God loves everyone, as John 3:16 tells us, if he has a chosen people group and tells them to commit mass murder and genocide on other people groups that are not part of the chosen?
Definitely repetitive. This is the same problem he had with forgiveness, but now with love instead. Being loving does not mean letting the world fall deeper into sin, nor does it mean letting the Canaanites get away with child sacrifice.
The examples here are almost endless, but I'll give you a few from the source material itself. I think the flood would be the first one, but we'll skip over that because I don't want to hear all the excuses.
You don't need to hear the excuses, you can just read them for yourself. Plus, what I've said already covers this, and probably this whole list you're bringing up.
Genocide of Jericho, which is found in Joshua 6:21.
Genocide of Jericho, he says. Do not know what genocide is? I would think most people do not think of genocide as destroying a city, but instead destroying a people or an entire nation. Not only that, but Rahab and her family survived on purpose. So even on a loose understanding of genocide, this wasn't it.
How many innocent women and children, hell, even the men, were no worse, at least, than the Israelites? Most of the tribes that get genocided for their evil deeds, their sin, their rejection of God, their wickedness, etc., are literally no different or have done even less harm or even less against God, Yahweh, than his own chosen people group.
Citation required. I can say Israel sinned worse, but only because they had greater knowledge. So what sins are you comparing in order to make that claim?
But let's talk about divorce.
Wow. It seems like he just added in divorce to make his list an even 20. The bulk of the response was to say that Christians are inconsistent, which he even admitted was not the topic of the video. But when he tried to claim God was being inconsistent, he had nothing. He instead tried to obfuscate by claiming God wouldn't have some specific laws for specific people, which is patently absurd.
Number 9, sacrifice. Not just sacrifice, human sacrifice. And we can double down and make it even worse, child sacrifice. The Bible talks about sacrifice being wrong. In fact, as given the justification for half of the genocides, it is because the land of Canaan was filled with people who performed child sacrifice. Let's look at just 3 examples, even though there's more. How about how the greatest test of faith was if Abraham was willing to kill his child? Brandon, gotcha. See, God didn't let him go through with it. God does not condone it. Just because God gave Abraham an out doesn't mean that he did not place a high value of importance in making sure that one of his followers was willing to kill his child for his belief in God. What that did, even though it didn't require the completion of the act, is it set up a hierarchy of God first over children.
And that is a proper hierarchy. But also, Isaac was not a child. Get your facts straight.
Many children have died because their parents spent their money, their time, their energy, their resources into God and not into their child.
Idiot parents do not an argument against God make.
But that's a hypothetical, I guess, since it didn't happen. So example 2 would be that of Jephthah, who makes a deal with God that he will kill the first thing out of his house if God gives him a victory. Now, we see God chastise neighboring people groups for doing exactly this, for doing child sacrifice to enact victory through their God. But he allows it with Jephthah. He takes the deal.
Oh, no, you don't. Don't put words in God's mouth. Nowhere in that passage does God approve of this vow. Just because God gave him victory doesn't mean it was because he made that stupid vow. This is nothing more than an argument from silence.
With the foreknowledge that the first thing out of his house would be his daughter. It is so simple. That is so clear. God accepts of child sacrifice. He gave a victory to this man because of what he was willing to give up, which was his child. And yes, God made him go through with it, unlike Abraham.
No, he didn't. In fact, it's entirely possible Jephthah did not literally burn his daughter, but instead relegated her life to celibacy in service of the temple, or at this time the tabernacle. But even if he did, this had nothing to do with God. We know God did not approve. Mindshift really needs to read Paul Copan's book.
And the one that somehow people just completely forget and ignore, God commits child sacrifice himself.
Wow. I really hoped he would be smarter than this. Can anyone take a guess at how old Jesus was? That's right, 33, or thereabouts. So he was obviously not a child. In fact, no one in any of these examples were children. Where is this child sacrifice we were promised by Mindshift?
God killed his only begotten son. It's his actual blueprint for salvation. It is his way to connect. It is the blood magic sacrifice needed to atone for our awful sinful nature that he allowed us to have and pass down to us generationally through Adam and Eve.
Is it just me, or is Mindshift getting dumber as the video goes on? Blood magic? Really? Define magic first, then define blood magic, then come back to me with that nonsense.
Let's go to point 10. We're only halfway there. I promise I'll start speeding up. And that's going to be other forms of marriage. We'll just breeze right through this one. I am told all the time in the comments, and I hear it all the time from Christians, that the Bible is clear. Marriage is a union between one man and one woman, unless it is between a man and his slave. That's a little bit different. It's still man and woman, but slave to master? How about a man and his concubines? Or, my personal favorite, all the God-given, God-ordained, God-blessed polygamy in the Bible. That's one man and multiple women. Up to 700 if we believe the accounts of Solomon. But many of the kings had entire harems of wives and concubines.
So this was a big nothing burger. Mindshift is confused about the difference between descriptive and prescriptive. One man, one woman is prescriptive, and all the examples of polygamy are descriptive. Even in all the examples, polygamy is not looked favorably on. Especially in one of the verses he had on screen, 1 Kings 11:3. Just read the next verse. It was not good for Solomon to have these wives.
Which is rape. Now this one should be so obvious, right? In fact, it's the main thing I hear from Christians. What stops the atheist from running around raping and pillaging? They love that phrase.
Do they? Do they really?
So, does God hate rape? Well, not for when he punished David by having all of his wives raped by someone that David knew closely outside in public.
You have not proven rape. In order to call it rape, you must show a lack of consent. But let's say some of them were raped. Where is God in that? Like, how did God make it happen? We know that the idea was given to Absalom by Bathsheba's father or grandfather, I don't remember which. So, where are you putting God in that chain? But what I want to do is focus on the specific words used. I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. And you can read the rest. The more you read it, the less it sounds like rape, and more like poetic justice against David. David did not rape Bathsheba, so neither was David's wives raped.
And that's not the only time that God uses rape as punishment, which I'd love to know how that works. How is the free will for the men who are sent to rape this woman? How is the free will for the woman who is now getting raped?
This is even a worse example of rape than the last one. Also, a worse example of God commanding or condoning it. This is a warning passage, not a command to rape, but of course there isn't anything in this verse to imply that it's rape anyway, instead of just the woman committing adultery.
We also see a ton of issues with women who have been raped if they didn't cry loud enough to show that they weren't enjoying it, being subject to punishment and murder. We see rape victims forced to marry their rapists.
Women tend to cry out. God does not subscribe to Me Too. The woman can and should make the rape known, and God gives women the benefit of doubt in the country. Let's read Deuteronomy 22:28. If a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out. Let me say that again, because emphasis is hard with voice synthesizers. And they are found out. They are in this together. It is not rape, it is consensual.
We'll be talking about slavery for point 20, and there's plenty of sexual slavery, which obviously involves rape, that is 100% condoned and endorsed by God. You can rape your enemies, you can rape as punishment. Can you imagine if a judge ordered that in a court of law? You can be murdered for being raped because it seemed like you liked it. It's disgusting.
Literally none of that is true. Rape is punishable by death in ancient Israel. End of story.
Incest. Surely incest is wrong. This is more of just a fun thought experiment. I won't use the typical verses like how Lot's daughters essentially raped their father, which was needed, by the way, for the genealogies that are going to be important, that God would use that.
Mindshift seems to make a habit of saying he's not going to use something and immediately use it. Is that condescending? I don't know. It feels condescending adjacent, at least. Anyway, God uses people's sins. He works all things for good. Why are you acting ignorant of this basic Christian principle? Didn't you say you were a Christian once?
But how do you think, if you believe in the accounts of either part of Genesis, the world came into being? Human population grew. After the garden or after the flood? It requires incest.
So does evolution.
Period. And that's God's ideal, right? God could have put other people on the boat that were not related to Noah.
If any of them wanted to, yes. But they didn't, so they literally missed the boat.
God could have started with multiple chains of families in the garden so that there would not be incest.
That has some serious theological or maybe soteriological implications, which I don't think you've thought about.
So we have necessary incest in Genesis, and by Leviticus, it is outlawed. God's objective morality?
This is probably the only law that only applies after a certain time in history. But it is also a bit ironic for an evolutionist to complain about incest. Like, unless you think bunches of people were just popping up all the time and all over the place, then you have incest. Incest is unavoidable when starting from two people, which no matter what worldview you have, you would have had to start with two people. It is objectively not wrong for the children of only two people on Earth to marry their siblings. Times and circumstances change.
13 will be quick because we've kind of talked about it, but how about adultery? This is definitely bad. We know it. God says it. Jesus says it. Even looking at a woman with lust in your heart is considered the exact same sin as committing adultery itself. We even see King David, one of God's favorites, being punished. Well, not him being punished, his son and other wives being punished for his adultery that he committed with Bathsheba. So yeah, God says adultery is wrong, unless he blesses you with multiple wives. I guess it's not adultery if they're also your wife. But if marriage is just between one man and one woman, then how do we ever get a second wife? Oh, because God's morality is not so objective.
Where did that come from? What does any of that have to do with objectivity? God never commanded David to take multiple wives. God did command the kings to only take one wife. And we've already said how the Bible looks unfavorably on polygamy.
What about when Abraham had sex with his slave, Hagar? I can prove to you that this was approved by God because when Hagar got pregnant from that and ran away because Sarah had been so upset that she was mistreating her, what did God do? He sent an angel to go and retrieve Hagar and bring her back to her master, Abraham.
It goes without saying that Mindshift would make a terrible God. He would just be constantly like, nope, it's my way, no exceptions. I don't care what excuses you have. God, on the other hand, is full of mercy. God sending Hagar back was a mercy to her, not an acceptance of what Abraham did. Abraham was in the wrong, and God did not approve of the situation, but he will work within it.
And he continued to bless Abraham, which, by the way, we see God removing covenants and blessings left and right in the Old Testament when people disobey him. And yet, supposedly, every single promise that God made Abraham came to fruition. But adultery is always wrong, unless God needs it for fulfillment of his plans. Okay.
First of all, citation required. Where did God remove a covenant? Second of all, adultery is always wrong. It's just not always punished.
14's a fun one, animal cruelty. Well, Brandon, listen, we were given dominion over the animals, okay? What we do with them, how we utilize them for food or shelter or clothing, whatever, like, that's why God gave them to us. But Proverbs 12:10 states that a righteous man cares for the needs of his animal. That looks like some part of God's morality and plan for us to take care of his creation, take care of these animals. He created animals with some form of sentience, some form of consciousness, and pain receptors that work in them the same way that it works in us, and yet commands so much animal sacrifice, so much butchering and murdering of animals. God created animals to feel pain and then gave us the go-ahead to create the pain, but also tells us to take care of them, be stewards of them, and that righteous men will treat them well. That word objective is starting to sound really weird to me all of a sudden.
Only all of a sudden? It seems like you have a strained relationship with the word objective from the beginning. Anyway, animal cruelty is another weak one. First, animals do not feel pain in the same way humans do. They feel pain, but they don't really seem to suffer. If you've ever had a sick pet, or with some sort of injury, then you know what I'm talking about. The same sickness or injury in a human that causes them to whine and moan and not get out of bed. In an animal will be a minor inconvenience. And you don't even need a pet to know this. Just think of animals that go after beehives and don't seem to care that they're being stung. Second, animals killed for sacrifice are killed fairly quickly without much pain. It's not as if they were tortured. In fact, they usually live their best life before the end.
While we're talking about the confusion of what rules we follow when, let's move into point 15, which is observance of the Sabbath. Now, Brandon, that's clearly an Old Testament thing, but Jesus came to uphold and fulfill the law. Jesus was accused of not honoring the Sabbath, but God of the Old Testament smites a dude who's picking up sticks to keep his family warm and fed on the Sabbath.
Stop. I am not going to let that unsubstantiated rhetorical conjecture stand. He did not need to pick up sticks. His family wasn't going to starve or freeze, and he was fairly warned.
But then God doesn't get mad when people are working on the Sabbath when Nehemiah is building the wall, at least not to the point of any consequence, like how he struck the one dude dead. Man, this is confusing.
It really isn't. If someone were to take what Mindshift said at face value and not check his references, they might conclude that God struck the man dead like Obed, who touched the Ark of the Covenant. But anyone who checks would know that God only commanded he be killed. And this was when Israel was a full theocracy. During Nehemiah, Israel is scattered and only now coming back to the land. They are not a full government yet. They cannot afford to execute Sabbath breakers, assuming they even would. This, as usual, says nothing about objective morality or this hypothetical hypocrisy he's trying to hamstring into the argument.
God punishing future generations. Now, first of all, we have Adam and Eve as the prototypical mother and father that introduced sin into the world and thus original sin on everyone. And then we have specific verses where God does curse people to the fourth generation. Then we have other verses where God says, I will not curse children for the sins of their father or parents for the sins of their children.
I am curious what translation Mindshift is using to come up with the word curse here. All of those verses say visiting the iniquity unto the third and fourth generation, not cursing them. This is just reaping what you sow. The mistakes you make will affect your children, who will likely make the same mistakes.
We still hear about generational curses today. Go to any evangelical church and you're going to see spirits of dissension, spirits of alcohol, spirits of pornography, spirits of lust that have been generationally handed down.
Any evangelical church? Look, I don't visit other churches, but it ain't that common. I will accept that some churches do that, but some churches also have gay pastors, so that doesn't hold water.
You're going to learn and see YouTube videos about how to break the cycle of generational sin. But I thought God didn't do that anymore.
When did God ever do that? Even if we accepted what Mindshift said earlier about generational sin, it still wouldn't follow with spirit of drunkenness or any of these other spirits he mentioned.
17. Let's get into matters of equality. I hear apologists talk left and right about our inherent dignity as creatures and creation of God. So we won't talk about God's homophobia.
You cannot just say stuff and expect it to make sense. You have to think about what you are saying.
Let's talk about the inequality of women. Let's talk about misogyny. Let's talk about God's misogynistic tendencies.
Good luck with that. No ancient text lifts women up as much as the Bible.
If we truly have a God who created man and woman separate but equal, why are women worth 2/3 that of a man?
Not enough context to go off. We know it had to do with a certain vow, but this valuation is just monetary, not ontological. Are you going to conclude that God is ageist as well, just because he assigns different monetary values to men of different ages?
Why are women subordinate to their husband?
Why should it be the other way around? And don't say they should be equal in authority. Someone needs to be the final say, or it's anarchy.
Why are women not allowed to speak in church or to teach men?
You should really watch more Mike Winger. He's got a whole series on this topic, which at the time of this recording, he still hasn't finished yet. But Paul actually answers that himself, if you care to read it.
Why was man created first and woman was an afterthought?
Nothing is an afterthought with God. And again, a proper chain of authority must be kept.
Why is lineage only important because of the man you came from, and women are never mentioned in these genealogies? Women literally don't count in the polls, biblically speaking.
And how would you decide who to include instead? And conveniently, he doesn't include the next verse in the Numbers passage, which pretty much tells you why women are not counted in the census. Hint, women don't fight in wars.
God's covenant is with men only?
Wait! Did you just advocate for female genital mutilation and you think God is the misogynist?
Only males can be priests?
It's hard, bloody work. Not something you would want to put a woman through, unless maybe you were a misogynist.
God has sons, never daughters.
Don't act like you know what that verse means by sons of God.
If a priest's daughter sleeps around, burn her, says nothing about a priest's son.
It doesn't have to. Men typically don't go a-whoring, which is what the verse actually says, not sleep around.
Women are considered property?
The verse you cited does not support that.
To the extent that they are even swappable property?
That verse is about a punishment or consequence, not wife swapping.
Daughters can be sold on the same conditions as slaves.
And we have our first bona fide straw man. Most of the time Mindshift is just wrong, but this time he is actually being deceptive. That verse was about the difference between men and women's slaves. So Mindshift might as well be saying women can be sold as slaves, which so could men, of course, but at least he would have avoided the straw man.
In fact, the only reason that rape is ever considered wrong in the Bible is because it harms the property of a man. That's why the justice that comes from a rape is for that man to be repaid for his lost property or his devalued property.
The verse cited is not about rape.
Only witches, female witches, were killed.
Do you have an example of a male witch?
In fact, it says a mother is doubly unclean if she has a daughter.
Unclean does not mean sinful.
Menstruation is an infirmity that requires a sin penance.
First of all, it's sin offering, not sin penance. Didn't you say you used to be a Christian? Second, everybody sins. And Mindshift conveniently skipped over an important part again. It's only menstruations that happen outside the normal time that get the sin offering and burnt offering, not every time she menstruates.
Only women who are accused of cheating, because men can't really cheat, have to go through that magic trial of eating the dirt potion to make themselves barren or get an abortion for doing harm against the man.
Sigh. Where do I even begin? How about there is no abortion, or men can't get pregnant? Or maybe you could just define what you mean by magic again.
God allows polygamy only for men. You're a fool, and you haven't read your Bible. You don't know your God.
Ironic that you would claim anyone else hasn't read their Bible after all that. God only allowing polygamy for men is particularly ignorant. A polygamous woman would never know who the father of her children are. And again, polygamy is a bad thing. Read your Bible rather than just look up gotcha verses from online atheists who also didn't read their Bible.
And for 18, for cannibalism, let's get back to actually reading from some of these. Leviticus 26:27. But if in spite of this you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury, and I myself will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. Wow, we could have used this verse for a lot. Here we go, though. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters, and my soul will abhor you. Forced cannibalism of your sons and daughters as punishment.
I don't have enough ways to facepalm in this video. God did not force anyone to cannibalize their children. Also, that was more than one verse. That was 27 through 29.
Let's do another one, Jeremiah 19:7. And in this place I will make void the plans of Judah and Jerusalem, and will cause their people to fall by the sword before their enemies, and by the hand of those who seek their life. I will give their dead bodies for food to the birds of the air and to the beast of the earth. And I will make this city a horror, a thing to be hissed at. Everyone who passes by it will be horrified, and will hiss because of its wounds. And I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and their daughters, and everyone shall eat the flesh of his neighbor, with which their enemies and those who seek their life afflict them.
Did you forget your video title? Where in this section was the hypocrisy? Not that it matters, since God didn't remove their free will or force feed them their children, so he is not endorsing cannibalism. It's just to prophesy about what will happen.
Racism. Now, God is no respecter of persons, we are told in this book. We are told that God has a plan for everyone. We are told that God loves everyone, that we are all his creation, all made in the image of God. So no other person would be less than because of their ethnicity, correct? I mean, the first thing to bring up is that most of the genocide was because people were of the wrong people group.
I'm going to stop you right there. I can already see the mistake you're going to make. You're going to confuse nations with ethnicity. They are not the same.
But let's see if we can find some more specific verses. How about Nehemiah 13:23 through 30? I won't read you the whole thing, but interracial marriage here is seen as a great evil.
Well, that is indeed more specific. Okay, I'll let you have ethnicity for this one. However, it's pretty clear why he didn't want to read it. It actually spelled out the reason, or at least one reason, why Jews were not to marry foreigners. Because it was that very type of marriage that caused Solomon to sin.
Or in Genesis 9:24 through 27, we see that the descendants of one of Noah's grandsons, which would go on to become their own people group, were cursed by God to become the slaves of the others.
You have the Bible right in front of you. Why can you not read it? Noah cursed his son, not God. If you want to say God makes the curse true, that's fine, but don't cut out the middleman like that. Also, that is literally the same family, not different races.
In Exodus 23:23, we see God saying that these other people groups will not get to live in your land, and furthermore, that they will be cut down.
There's that conflation of nation and ethnicity.
In Nehemiah 13:3, we see a command to kick out all of the foreigners, all of the mixed. Wives and children were sent off essentially to die because God and Ezra were so displeased with the intermarriage that had happened, even though they were all worshiping Yahweh at that time.
It should always be suspicious when his explanation of the verse is longer than the verse itself, and he still didn't bother reading it. Way too much conjecture here. All it says is that they separated themselves, not that anyone was left to die or anything of the sort.
In Judges 12:4 through 6, the foreigner's accent offends thee so much that 42,000 are struck dead.
Another straw man, and this one is so much worse than the other. Anyone who actually reads the story know that the offense was not about an accent. The accent was just an identifier. And what does this one have to do with God?
A verse that we'll be utilizing for our final point about slavery, Leviticus 25:44, says that you can only buy slaves from neighboring nations. This is like the definition of racism.
No, that's confusing nations with ethnicity again, but it's more than that. Racism is hating an ethnic group just because of their ethnicity. It is not treating your own people in a slightly better way. If you had to choose between saving a family member and saving a foreigner, you are not racist for saving your brother. And likewise, that logic carries through to all the less extreme examples as well.
And if you really want to see the extent and the horror of God's racism, go read Numbers 25.
I have read Numbers 25, and it wasn't about races, it was about religion.
Almost no one in their right mind would say slavery is okay, except for God. And you can go read that verse in Leviticus, and I dare you to try to make the same excuses that apologists make. Oh, it's indentured servitude. Oh, it's actually beneficial for the individual. Oh, they wouldn't have had any other options. You mean any other options after the commanded mass murder, if not genocide, of all the males in their village? We're also going to be talking here about sexual slavery, where all the men are murdered, all the children are murdered, all the older women are murdered, except for what? Virginal young women? Why do you think they were kept? Well, Brandon, God had the Israelites make them wives. Oh, that's cool. That made everything better. Those women definitely wanted to be there. They definitely wanted to have sexual relations with the people that just killed their fathers. You're right.
So, you think they wanted to be homeless? You must really hate women, don't you? As for Leviticus 25:44, again, would you rather they be sold into the other nations who would abuse them? Or would you want Israel to buy them and then release them to be homeless, which, by the way, isn't really feasible? All right, that's enough of that garbage. It's not about slavery in general, it's about what kind of slavery. Everyone is a slave in some sense or another. Those of us forced to work for an hourly wage are slaves to that job. Sure, we can technically leave whenever, but we still need the job. And you, Mindshift, are a slave to your own desires. Slavery, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. If you think it is, then one of two things is happening. Either you are thinking of a specific type or form of slavery instead of just basic slavery in and of itself. or you have too much pride to let yourself serve another person. I have that pride myself to an extent, but at least I recognize it.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
And finally, it's done. That was a long one. We saw Mindshift make a lot of mistakes in there. He even managed to fit in those straw men he likes so much. He conflated terms, read things out of context, even though he said he wouldn't, made unjustified extrapolations, and just did an all-around poor job of making God into a hypocrite. It seemed like he was becoming more unraveled the closer it got to the end. I definitely feel like responding to someone else now for a while, but we shall see.
Oh, wow! K of the response was to say,